Good evening, and thank you for joining us. My name is Mariela Colon, and I'm a librarian here with the Chicago Public Library. Tonight's virtual program is another in our ongoing series of literary, cultural, and civic programming. Today's event is part of our Voices for Justice series, which seeks to highlight authors and thought leaders who can spark conversations in the areas of social justice. During tonight's program, we'll be monitoring an online chat for questions from the audience for a brief Q&A following the conversation. So please feel free to ask questions in the chat. It is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for the evening, Dr. Michael Staudenmeier. Dr. Michael Staudenmeier is an assistant professor of history at Manchester University in North Manchester, Indiana. He writes and teaches about race, racism, and anti-racism in United States history. His co-authored book, We Go Where They Go, The Story of Anti-Racist Action, will be published this fall by PM Press, and he is completing the manuscript of White, Black, Brown, Becoming Puerto Rican in Chicago, which is under contract with the University of North Carolina Press. He serves on the executive committee of the Puerto Rican Studies Association and on the board of directors of Dr. Pedro Albizu Campo, Puerto Rican High School in Humboldt Park. He lives in the Austin neighborhood on the west side of Chicago. I want to thank him for leading the discussion with tonight's keynote speaker, Dr. Kyle T. Mays. A reminder before I turn it over, we welcome your questions throughout tonight's program. Please place them on the Facebook or YouTube comments area, and we'll pass them on to the speakers. And with that, I'm happy to hand the program off to Dr. Staudenmeier.
Thank you so much, Mariela. I'm really excited to be here. I want to introduce Kyle Mays first. Kyle T. Mays is an Afro-Indigenous Saginaw Chippewa writer and scholar of U.S. history, urban studies, race relations, and contemporary popular culture. Born and raised in Michigan and the product of two different Big Ten schools, Michigan State and Illinois, he subsequently fled the Midwest for sunny Los Angeles, where he is an assistant professor of African American Studies, American Indian Studies, and History at UCLA. He's the author of Hip Hop Beats Indigenous Rhymes, Modernity and Hip Hop in Indigenous North America, 2018, City of Dispossessions, Indigenous Peoples, African Americans, and the Creation of Modern Detroit, 2022, and the book we're here this evening to discuss, An Afro-Indigenous History of the United States, 2021. He also contributed a chapter, Blackness and Indigeneity, to the New York Times bestseller 400 Souls, A Community History of African America, 1619 to 2019. And in a more personal vein, he is beloved as Uncle Kyle by my three children. So welcome, Kyle.
Thank you, Mike, for the introduction and for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation, and thank you to the Chicago Public Library and Mariela for reaching out, and I'm looking forward for tonight. And I sort of fled the Midwest for the fantastic 75-degree weather of Los Angeles year-round, only slightly.
All right. You're welcome back anytime, you know that. Let's start with the basics. What does Afro-Indigenous history mean?
I think for me, it's a combination of understanding both the history and the foundation of the United States is rooted in really two things. Both settler colonialism, that is the taking away of land from indigenous peoples, and then Europeans occupying that land and continuing to reproduce narratives of erasure, dispossession, and so forth. And the other foundational part of understanding U.S. democracy is enslavement. That is the enslavement of people of African descent. And so in the book, that is the thread that undergirds the entire manuscript. And what I try to show is both how it's foundational to the country's identity, but also how Black and Indigenous peoples have tried to resist that throughout U.S. history. And so for me, that's a foundational part of understanding not only history, but also where we should be going to the present, because it shapes not only Black and Indigenous peoples, Afro-Indigenous peoples, and so forth, but it shapes all of us in very particular and unique ways. And I think unless we have a full understanding of that, and then I'll put this in there so maybe we get to it later, something like contemporary discussions of reparations, land back, and so forth, without a clear understanding and analysis of history, I think we're going to have a faulty understanding of how to understand our current circumstance and where we're going to go going forward.
That makes a lot of sense. I think you've hinted at it, and we can probably just kind of dig in directly. in the introduction, you talk about the end of the introduction, you talk about the need to dream and to build. You have this sort of activist mentality kind of throughout the book. And, as we're all familiar, that sets you apart from a different style of historical writing that is mostly concerned just with describing the past. And I'm curious if you could talk about the ways in which you see your book as a political intervention in the present. How are you weaving those two pieces together, the past and the present?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I sound like a bad historian in some capacity, but for me, history is kind of, and if I'm talking to the public like we're doing here, I have to be honest. And history has declining enrollments kind of throughout a variety of sectors, whether it's universities and so forth, colleges and universities. And we have to be honest with ourselves and ask why. What are we teaching in certain classes? What classes are we offering, and so forth? And for me, history means very little. And I say very little to leave a little room just for nerding out about history. But it means very little if we're not applying it and really thinking about where we're going. Right? I can study all sorts of things in the past because I just have an interest. And I think that's okay. Excuse me, but we don't have a clear notion, especially for certain topics, because I don't think studying colonialism, racism, anti-Blackness, indigenous dispossession, and so forth, I don't think those are things just to be studied, but they're to be studied in order to understand a social phenomenon for what's happening in society today. And if we don't study those things, or we just look at them as very casual things, then we're doing a disservice to the people who are exploited, the people who were genocided was committed against them and continues to be committed against them. We're not being honest about current communities, whether that's the west side of Chicago, whether that's the east side of Detroit, whether that's rural communities, whether that's on the north side of Chicago reservation, what have you. Those communities continue to suffer under a variety of things, which are still fundamentally rooted in colonialism and racism. And unless we have a clear understanding of history again, we're just going to let things perpetuate. And I think it's our duty as historians to be very much concerned with the present and using history to help people see the roots of certain social phenomena today.
Yeah, so I mean, you and I've had this part of this conversation a million times about the link between the past and the present and the need to kind of frame our current political options in a historical context. With that in mind, your book covers an enormous amount of ground geographically, but also chronologically.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you could talk about one or two of the historical figures in the book that you think kind of best embody the intertwining of these aspects of U.S. history, Indigenous and Black.
I think the first one that always comes to mind, excuse me, is Stokely Carmichael, who would change his name to Kwame Ture. And I like to mention him because, to me, in my analysis of the Black Anarch Power movement, he was one of the few Afro-Indigenous peoples, people of African descent who clearly understood that this is Indigenous people's land. Why is that important? That is important because without that particular starting point of an analysis for non-Indigenous peoples to this particular space, that is what has become the United States, then we're doing ourselves a disservice of erasing Indigenous peoples, right? So if we center Indigenous land, I don't mean as a form of property ownership, but as how we relate to land and how land relates to us and how we all relate to a particular space. So I mean urban, I mean all sorts of land. And he understood that. I think in a speech that he gave in St. Paul, Minnesota in 1975, he is very much invested in telling Indigenous peoples, but also Black folks, because he wasn't always very much concerned that much with Indigenous land. It was initially a question for him. So if you look at early writings of his in the Black Studies Journal, The Black Scholar, published in 1969, it was a question for him whether Black people could belong in the United States. He hadn't come to the full analysis, which he would 6 years later in St. Paul, Minnesota, talking to a mixed group of predominantly indigenous peoples. And what he really determined was, well, this is Native people's land, and my role as an activist, not from here, is to be in support of them as much as I can. This is also a global part of his analysis of what he called the All African Revolutionary People's Party. And he tried to articulate a vision. Now, there's other conversations we probably won't have about, even African Americans and people of African descent in the Americas who have been here for generations and returning to the African continent, which could certainly cause issues of colonialism, things like Marcus Garvey, for example, calling himself the provincial president of Africa and so forth. So there can be issues around that. But he understood the phenomena, at least in the US. And he carried that well into his 60s until he passed away. So I think that is one particular example. And I'll use a personal example that's actually not in the book, but I'll use my great-grandmother. So my great-grandmother, her name was Esther Mays, Esther Shaboose Mays, or Keadnokwe was her indigenous name. She's a Saginaw Chippewa woman who came to the city of Detroit in the spring of 1940. And she was 16, and she ended up marrying an African American male. And she got a lot of issue for that. You can imagine a young Native woman marrying an African American male. And so what I learned from her and studying her, hearing oral histories, researching her family histories and so forth, she was a co-founder of what was called Detroit's Indian Education and Cultural Center. And she is very much dedicated to making sure that young people in cities had education and cultural knowledge. Young Native kids, young Afro-Indigenous kids, mixed Indigenous heritages from both Canada and the US. And so for me, it's thinking about what would it take to put those kind of two people in conversation, working at both the local level and also the transnational level of solidarity and activism. And again, centering land in the space that you're in. So in other words, as Leah Simpson might say, land as being a form of pedagogy. Long-winded, my apologies.
Not at all. I like that pairing a lot. I think slightly on tangent, but maybe linked here. As I read your book, I'm kind of repeatedly struck with the way in which you're attending to what, as historians would talk about as intellectual history. A lot of this book is about history of ideas of what is Blackness, ideas of it, what is indigeneity, what is solidarity. There's a bunch of others in here as well. And so in that way, in many cases, your focus on characters is also a focus on writers and thinkers every bit as much as it is on activists. Obviously, those are not mutually exclusive categories. Stokely Carmichael is a great example. But I'm curious why you ended up choosing to focus on the history of ideas to the extent that you did in this book, and what does that allow us to do maybe that different approaches to an Afro-Indigenous history of the United States might not have done?
Yeah, I think so. There's two challenges of writing a large, and this book is small, like versus the sort of time periods and geographies covered. And so what a book like this does is you take large ideas and you try to tell them through the characters in the book, right? So I think that approach is more helpful. So a lot of, we'll say, an Afro-Indigenous history is dominated in the US at least by discussion of the 5 tribes. So that's Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole. The history of enslavement, that is those 5 tribes enslaving people of African descent, and those people of African descent going with them during their own removal, what was called Indian removal or the Trail of Tears. And I didn't want to write that history because that history has been written many times in a variety of contexts, And there's still a lot to be done. Perhaps the most recent iteration, which is a fantastic book and I highly recommend it, is my colleague Elena Roberts at the University of Pittsburgh. And her book, I've Been Here All the While, Black Freedom on Native Land. And looking at something like the Tulsa race riots and so forth, or massacre. And so a history of ideas allows you to connect things in a much more broader way and make it more palatable to a particular audience so they can build these connections in understanding US history. And it's a function, and perhaps this is too technical, it's a function of the archive. And that is, for those who are not trained historians, the sources that you have to use to build an argument. Many of the stories that I tell in the book and characters might be accessible, but they're not accessible in the way that I put them or how I imagine them or connect them. And so it takes a lot of building and writing in a particular way to allow them to be narrated in a certain way. So intellectual history does a lot of things. And it's funny, I used to consider myself a social historian. I'm absolutely not a social historian. But it allows you to talk about complex ideas in a very unique way and connect certain histories that have been, I'll say, deliberately disconnected from our understanding of history.
Yeah, that I think one of the examples that I loved most of what you're describing right here is the, encounter, or is it even an encounter, between Charles Eastman and W.B. Du Bois at the Universal Races Conference in 1911. And I'm wondering if you could just expand on that, both from the maybe kind of recap some of what happens, what we know happens, but also some of that imaginative piece that you're trying to kind of get in the heads of people who have been long dead, and you can't find the archival evidence that maybe is the proof you need. The smoking gun isn't there.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you could tell that story briefly, but then also talk about that speculative aspect of what you've done.
Yeah, so this was a conference held in London over the last weekend in July in 1911. It's called the Universal Races Congress, as Mike just said. And it was supposed to bring together races from all over the world. So if people forget, Japan was an imperial power at this time. So you had folks from Japan, from South Africa, throughout Europe, from the US, South America, everywhere. And they wanted to see if we could use education to educate the masses back in their home territories about the problems of race, because their thought was, if we educated people better and we understood that we had a common humanity, then it would sort of end racism. Of course, we know that ain't true to this day. It takes a lot more than education, but it made some sense, a little bit of sense for the time. And so Eastman and Du Bois are on the same program and share papers about the plight of the Negro and the plight of the American Indian. Now, where I try to imagine is, what would a conversation between them have looked like? So I know Du Bois particularly references, and he has a photo of Charles Eastman in The Crisis, the organ for the NAACP, which Du Bois edited probably for like 28, 30 years or something like that. And that's like the only small piece of evidence I ever had to say that they talked. But I try to say, what if they had lunch? What if they shared a drink and we're just talking about the differences and complexities and connections between Black and Indigenous relations within the US, right? And it was a moment for me, because I hesitated putting that in there. But I did it because often some of the best conversations can come many places. It can come at a pub, it can come over lunch, it can come over many connections, but you have to sit down and have those conversations, right? And this is something that when people ask me what we should do, et cetera, well, one, I don't know if we understand the problem fully still as a collective, whatever that collective means. Two, what would it mean to have a multi-generational set of folks to sit down and talk about get some Black, Indigenous accomplices and so forth to talk about particular issues. What would that look like and what would that mean, right? And make sure you have some food, something to drink for people and so forth, because those things are also essential to a variety of communities. And that's it sounds simple, but I kid you not. And this is, of course, in a world without COVID and so forth. But it sounds simple, but an important part of, I think, how we should really begin to imagine our futures.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And I think, it is one of those places where you're doing a really good job of connecting past and present, right? You're saying, these are the things we need to do now. And, here's how maybe they happened. We can't really know for sure, back then. But in that same example, and this is one of 100 places throughout your book where you do this, you also, your writing is, shall we say, simultaneously scholarly and conversational, right? So you've got the line about whether they were chopping it up, and I wonder if you could speak to your writing as part of this, not uniquely to the Eastman Du Bois encounter, but just in general throughout the book. How did you choose to strike the balance you did between, I won't say an academic, this doesn't read like an academic book, at least not to me, but to a scholarly writing style, to something that's maybe less scholarly but more engaging, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, well, one of my mentors was Dr. Geneva Smitherman, who is the author of Talking and Testifying the Language of Black America. And through her writing style, if you have never read any of her work, just go read it. Through her writing style, I was like, if I ever get a chance to write a longer book the way I want to write the book, I'm going to write like in my own voice in a way that makes sense to people. So um, I just started writing, and then I was like, hell, we'll see what my editor says. And my editor, Gayatri, was, she was cool with it. And so one, having a supportive editor always helps. But the other thing is, and this is to the students in the audience, young people, and really no matter the age, if you're a student, really is long as the subject and verbs agree in some capacity, that's what really, and you have a solid argument evidence, to me, that's what quality writing is. And I tell people, what's your favorite show, movie, book, or what have you that has a variety of dialogue? I like to use Insecure as a good example because I think it's well written, right? And so you have a variety of writers writing on the show. And I think, even for the history profession, we have to find ways for younger historians, developing historians, students of history to be able to express themselves. So when I'm even teaching courses, I ask them about their writing style, and it's not something often that my colleagues and I ask them. And I ask them, what are your thoughts about writing? How do you write? When do you write best? We have a cat sighting here. And so I try to tell them that there are many approaches to writing and that your job is to get your voice out, right? I might be the only class that you can write this way, but without you having your own kind of voice and style, then even if you write a fantastic 10-page paper, all the evidence is cited, citations are well, it's boring, right? Now there are rare exceptions, but like get some flavor to the writing, put some seasoning on the writing. It's good for people. And, in a certain age we're in, often people may not want to sit and read a whole book in a certain way, right? Like, I do this for a profession. Mike and I do this for a profession, and we both generally like reading, although I did not like reading as a kid. So there's hope for those who don't like reading.
I mean, that's very real. I think in terms of the way that I grade my students, the writing rubric that I use has a kind of, there are three issues. One is your sentence structure, your grammar, all of that. The second one is organizational, paragraph and organizational structure of the writing. But the third one is, are you implementing an authorial voice that's authentic to you? And that seems to me the thing that you've achieved here. I've been witness to some of that over time, but I think you clearly have gotten to a point where you feel very comfortable writing the way that you write. And I think in my estimation, it makes it far more engaging, you're right, than a lot of more academic writing, certainly.
Well, I must say, my dissertation advisor, shout out Fred Hoxie. When I finished, he would say, I was always trying to change your writing, but you never listened to me. And you've done a really good job writing. And I understand why like you want to do that, but I really appreciated his mentorship and letting me make mistakes and kind of go on a journey of writing and learning my own style.
So maybe we can move into some of I think it's maybe the final third of the book that feels very sort of present oriented. You've got lots of stuff in there, questions of cultural appropriation, issues of, native mascots, all of that is, these are very present day issues. First, let me ask you, if there's any one of those that you would want to extract, a sort of contemporary issue that you think has particular resonance in 2022. Obviously, the book is new, but at the same time, I know how it goes writing books. Some of this was written longer ago, and some of it was written more immediately. What of these issues that you raise in the book that are current topics, which ones really grab you now in our present moment, and why?
Let's go cultural appropriation and then reparations, if that's okay.
Yeah, totally.
So this is going to sound strange, but I have to get tired of the limitations around the discourse of cultural appropriation, and we'll say representation, I think is important. So the book was out before the fantastic show Reservation Dogs came out. It's on Hulu. Excuse me. And if you haven't seen it, do check it out. And it follows 4 young Native kids in Oklahoma, and they're doing a lot of mischievous stuff, but dealing with stuff that, even I've seen growing up and visiting some of my cousins who lived on the res, and just kind of dealing with what young people often have to deal with. It's witty, it's funny, and so forth. But a lot of my social media was kind of hit up around the issue of representation. And so, one of my good friends also likes as well, Dr. Bryce Henson, who I learned a lot about, Black cultural studies, Stuart Hall, always asking me about representation is meaningful, right? But what does it actually mean? And it's a question that's always stuck with me and anchored my analysis of popular culture and so forth. So I think some people equate better representation with forms of decolonization. Right? Now, for me, as a fundamental part of decolonization is returning land. I don't think there's a direct line between better representation in TV and Hollywood. And while I think there's a place for that, right, I'm not hating on that. But I do think people conflate certain ideas of what representation does actually mean and what it can be. There are real limitations to that. So the discussion of cultural appropriation without an analysis of power, capitalism, and so forth, it just becomes very narrow. Like, so we get rid of mascots. And by the way, although Native activists have been fighting for this for decades, it really took billionaires to get the owner of the Washington football team, our Commanders, or whatever the hell their name is now, Dan Snyder. They said, we're going to pull your advertisements. And that's what really caused the tipping point, if we're honest. So that's a discussion of capitalism. And that's not negating years of activism. Fantastic groups like Illuminative of the last several years who've been raising awareness about Native representation. But it takes an analysis of capital to really get at something like that. So that's on the one hand. But again, representation is not going to necessarily save us. And as far as reparations, go ahead.
I was just going to say, in terms of representation, an example that I sometimes use in the world of Latino history is Al Pacino in Scarface, right? No one will ever cast Al Pacino as a Cuban refugee turned gangster, right? That's never going to happen again. So representation has shifted, but it doesn't, in any direct way, at least, equate to material improvements in the lives of U.S. Latinos, right? So
That's
I think we're on the same page about that. That it's important, but it does not solve the fundamental problems that, as you're pointing out, are often socioeconomic in important ways on top of representation questions.
Yes, and I was much older than I'd like to admit when it never dawned on me that he was not Latino at all. He was not Cuban at all. Going from The Godfather to Scarface it makes sense when you look at it now, but it just didn't make sense to me until much later when I was like, I don't think he's Italian, which is cool. Nothing wrong with being Italian. But it never dawned on me. So quickly about reparations, and perhaps I'll get in trouble for this, but I'm not opposed to people, and we'll say where I'm talking about sort of a mainstream discussion of reparations. I'm not opposed to people's immediate needs being met. So I think some people, and inflation is crazy, rents are going up, the cost of food, the cost of living in general is going up. I'm in LA, and you don't even know about the gas prices, but that's everywhere, right? Wherever people are living. People need cash now, so I'm not opposed to that, right? But when I hear about discussions of reparations and Black folks perhaps claiming land, wanting 40 acres and a mule, and some people did get that. So shout out to, I mentioned it earlier, Elena Roberts' book. Some people did get 40 acres. But the real, more fundamental question to me is, do we want reparations under capitalism? I think that's kind of where the discourse should perhaps go in a certain way. Do you really want reparation under capitalism? That's not to say, people's, I want to reiterate this, people's immediate needs need to be met. That's not the point. But it's fundamental. Like, can this work under here? And even certain, with the exception of a few organizations, including the Indian Collective, who have a very clear critique of white supremacy, capitalism, and so forth. Even discussion around land back, right? So some people are like, oh, we can just purchase land, or maybe some settler capitalists is just going to, out of the kindness of their heart, which there's no such thing, they're just going to give back our land and so forth. No, that's not how this works. And Mike, maybe I'm wrong, but there's a whole civil war in this country over slavery, which is about capitalism and some other stuff too, or states' rights. I forgot. No, we're in the North. We can say states' rights, right? Anyways.
Well, I mean, I think in terms of this question of land as a form of reparations, in an indigenous context, I'm curious, because I think this is something that happened after you put the book to press. If you have thoughts on the Oklahoma ruling that the Supreme Court issued a year ago, that basically, as I understand it, says a significant portion of Oklahoma's land is now sovereign native territory, but because there's no fundamental reconfiguration of the economic factors, of ethno-racial factors, what does that do? What is the result of that? Is that an example of the kind of thing you're talking about in terms of the problems or limitations of reparations, short of a thorough kind of overhaul of society?
Absolutely. I haven't followed it in a while, but I do believe that they're trying to get out of that ruling, the state of Oklahoma, in some capacity. I don't know the details of that, but it's something that they're definitely trying to, like, no, we don't want these problems, among other issues around abortion and so forth. So, but that's what I mean. And Yeah, there's just a whole another conversation around sovereignty and its relationship to reproducing certain ideas um, of society or legitimating society in a certain way, but sure we don't have time for that.
Um, uh, it looks like we're getting some questions from people who are watching, which is wonderful. The first one here is, did you, in the process of your research, learn anything new that surprised you?
Anything that surprised me? Um, I think the one thing that I don't know why I didn't really write about it. Maybe I was in a certain mood, but I have a long quote about William Mankiller in there, and she's quoting Chinua Achebe and Things Fall Apart. But she's also very actively anti-Cherokee freedmen as well. Um, my brain can't recollect as to why I didn't really. I think I just wanted to kind of avoid that discussion overall. That I ended up putting in the preface, or I'm sorry, in the postscript, but I didn't really address that. And I think if I would have talked more about the five tribes, I would have addressed that. So that's kind of a surprising portion of uncovering and we'll say reconnecting some of these histories in a particular way.
That's really interesting to me because I remember thinking when I was reading the postscript, where did Wilma Mankiller come down on the question of the freedmen citizenship issue? So that's it seems like an interesting contradiction in some ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
No, continue if you have more, or I have another
Yeah,
question.
I was going to say, I think perhaps she shifted, at least publicly, later in life before she passed away. But as principal chief, that just wasn't the case.
Okay. Another question from the audience. What do you think of land acknowledgements? We didn't do one at the beginning of this event, for instance. What's your take on them?
So my First Nations folks up in Canada have a much more radical perspective on this. I'm not mad at it. For some people, it's just a neoliberal acknowledgement we're on indigenous people's land, but we have no real desire to return it in any capacity. That's kind of the take that some people have, and I don't disagree. Like I'm okay if people do one. I'm okay if people don't do one. If there's a particular reason as to why, we don't do one either, because what are we doing to, and also in the city context, shout out to Shy Native Youth Council, what are we doing to assist and help even urban indigenous communities, so Chicago, LA, and so forth? Right, that's just a start, and that's just something local. And while I have many issues with just donating money, etc., sometimes that's helpful for certain, especially very local communities and groups. It's a major contradiction that has been around since forever. That is, you need funds and resources to really deal with particular social issues in order to keep going.
There's another question. What do you suggest I say to the administrator of a school when I see a teacher having her students make and wear feathers around Thanksgiving?
Feathers? We're still doing this? I did it as a kid too. Like Black, Native people, accomplices, and so forth. We live in a white supremacist settler colonial society. And we're not educated. So I think the often the best approach is letting them know about the local indigenous peoples of this area. So if it's Chicago, who are the local indigenous peoples in Chicago?
Mm.
Potawatomi and others, right? You have to start local. It's much easier to say this is wrong, racist, which it is. And I'm not dismissing the racism, but people often hear it differently when you are saying, hey, can we actually focus on the local indigenous peoples? and bring a living, breathing Native person from Chicago into the classroom, right? So I always advocate for Indigenous hip hop artists, people who do creative things too. So
Mhm.
students can see, oh, these are Native people, one, are still alive, but two, do very contemporary, unique things. That way it disrupts the stereotypes around feathers. And also tell them about the spike, the head that was placed on a spike. That was really uh, so there are two versions of Thanksgiving, like 20 years apart. There kind of was a cool one where the Wampanoag were feeding the starving colonists. They had good relations, or at least cordial. And then the one where they put Metacom's head on a stake and left it in front of the town, I think Plymouth, for like 20 years, 19 years, I think. So tell that version of Thanksgiving as well,
Mhm.
and see if the parents are willing to have their children do something like that. But I wouldn't be surprised if we care.
Another question from the audience. How do Blackness and indigeneity intersect in the global South? And how do you see this intersection sometimes being dismissed in the global North? Expanding our focus here beyond the US.
I think this is not my expertise, but people I've learned a great deal from. Jessica Hernandez, who I think has been on the program very recently with in her book Fresh Banana Leaves, and in Oaxaca on the coast often, that there are Afro-Indigenous peoples there, that there are Garifuna peoples and Honduras and other parts of Central and South America. And I'm not super familiar with that history, just what I've learned from friends and read just very casually. There's also tension there as well. Um, uh, like my colleague Shona Jackson, it's a little technical, but there are instances when indigenous peoples have been erased and black people then are saying we are the new indigenous peoples or citizens, right? So it's very complicated in the Caribbean, in the U.S., and Central and South America as well. But there certainly have been acts of solidarity.
Mhm.
And even with the new census in Mexico, which would I'm blanking on the year, Mike, but I think this was in 2019, maybe 18.
I'm not sure.
But I just learned recently that it was really about counting Afro-Indigenous peoples as well. And I just saw in the English version of the U.S. media is often about counting just black people,
Mhm.
but it wasn't discussed that, oh, well, we're also counting Afro-Indigenous peoples.
Here's a big question. What do you think the role of historians can be in movements for social justice?
Well, I will say I don't want too many historians leading any revolutions. I don't want too many historians doing that. Um, but what historians can do, and I think should do, is you help educate the people. And this is why your work is kind of important. So, of course, we have our professional responsibilities. You know, you might have family responsibilities as well. And, you know, frankly, I always looked at Mike here as someone who, at least for me, has been a role model in doing some of this work really well. There's a certain sacrifice and understanding you have to make in order to build community. And building community takes a lot of work. There's a lot of sacrifice of family, friends, certainly misunderstandings and so forth. But it takes a certain humility as a scholar to say, I know about something intellectually, right? But perhaps I should not be in a leadership position, or perhaps I should really sit down and learn from the communities in which I'm working with. And we're in a profession where humility isn't always the best thing to have because you're constantly shot down. And if you're just going humble, you'll get pounded into the ground because we're always criticized, critiqued, and so forth. So I think the major role is to help educate and disseminate information.
We've got a few more. How long did it take you to decide on the title of the book?
Immediately.
So you knew from the beginning before you had an outline even, this is going to be the title?
So for the sake of time, I blindly and arrogantly talk about arrogant and non-humble scholars, sent it to Beacon Press through their regular channels. I thought they had gotten rid of it. Months later, Gayatri, the editor, now director of Beacon, said her editorial assistant had found it. And then she said, "This is great, but would you mind putting it in this series, Revisioning American History series?" And then from that was the immediate point.
Another one. What do you think about Black being sort of a misnomer, and that people that are considered to be Black are in actuality one and the same with Indigenous or Aboriginal American folk?
I have no idea what that means, although I know where it comes from. I will say I have indigenous roots from the African continent that I am not aware of, and I have indigenous roots from folks within the U.S., from around the Michigan Great Lakes area. And I don't think there's any good circumstance where people of African descent erase indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, that is North America today.
Can you recommend other books or organizations to follow after reading your book?
Yeah, check out Indian Collective. They're doing amazing work and working on some really fantastic things around reparations, around land back, which is an important conversation, and have been doing fantastic things. There's one in particular that I can think of.
Is that, I'm not familiar with that. Is it a website or?
Yeah, so they have a website. Let me see if I can put it in the chat real quick. They have a website, position papers. Here it is right here. I'll put it in the chat.
Great.
I think I sent that to Mariela.
Okay, great. I'm sure she'll get it out. So as we're kind of getting close to time, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about upcoming publications or other publications that you want people to be on the lookout for. And what do you have coming next, I guess, is the big question here.
So very quickly, have a book forthcoming that was mentioned that just came out last week or 2 weeks ago now, called City of Dispossessions. And it looks at the history of colonialism and capitalism through the notion of dispossession and how it's impacted Black and Indigenous peoples in Detroit from the late 19th century to the present, really up to the emergency management era. And the first one goes on Indigenous hip hop, which I tried to utilize to demonstrate how Black and Native peoples are very much connected through popular culture and the possibilities and impacts of that. So that's where I'm at right now. Mike, what do you have going on?
Well, I have, as Mariela said at the beginning, I've got this co-authored book that's coming out this fall. It's definitely a non-academic book, but it's we did as rigorous a job as I would do in any other context. That's on the history of a grassroots anti-fascist group from the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s called Anti-Racist Action. So it's called We Go Where They Go, the story of anti-racist action. And then I am very slowly working on my manuscript for North Carolina Press on Puerto Rican Chicago. So that's called White, Black, Brown, Becoming Puerto Rican in Chicago, and it's part of University of North Carolina Press has a new Latinx Histories series, and I'm excited to be part of that. But as you know, the teaching grind can sometimes take the time away from the writing opportunities. Although I guess you don't necessarily have that same experience.
No, I don't.
Mariel, do we have other? All right, I think we are ready to go. Kyle, it's been absolutely wonderful to spend this time with you. And yeah, this has been great. Thank you for joining us.
Great. Thank you both so much. That's all the time we have for this evening. I want to thank Dr. Kyle T. Mays and Dr. Michael Stoudemire for leading such a lively discussion. Dr. Mays' book is called An Afro-Indigenous History of the United States. You can check it out at the Chicago Public Library or any of your other local libraries. And we also encourage you to visit an independent bookstore to purchase a copy. Tonight's program will be available on the Chicago Public Library YouTube and Facebook page. If you have friends who weren't able to join us tonight, please invite them to watch it on demand. And please visit the Chicago Public Library website for many more upcoming virtual events, especially part of our Voices for Justice series. Again, thank you, Kyle and Michael, and thanks to everyone for putting in those really great questions. To all the teachers in the audience, thank you for tuning in. Everyone have a great night and stay well.